This edition of MacVoices is supported by Care.com, the easy and reliable way to find and manage care for everyone in the family. Save 30% on a Care.com premium membership using the link care.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, a little while ago, some of us invested in the MacBook Pro with Touch Bar because, first of all, we were kind of desperate for new MacBook Pros at that point. But, of course, there's always that allure of new hardware and something new and cool. And then Josh Centers comes along and tells me that the Touch Bar is not such a good idea. Josh, welcome. It's good to have you back.
Thanks for having me back, Chuck.
So you penned this article in TidBITS a little while ago. Our schedules, we couldn't really get together until now, but I was kind of anxious to talk to you about this. I wish I completely disagreed with you, but I may not agree with you as strongly as you stated it. So I'm going to just put it to you. What's wrong with the Touch Bar from your perspective?
It's crap.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have, folks.
Thanks for tuning in today.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not. That's an exaggeration. It's not terrible. It's not useless, and I point that out in the article. I don't think it's useless. I just don't think it's particularly useful. I think it's more gimmick than practical. And there's two main reasons for this. The first is, according to Apple's own human interface guidelines, there should be no functionality exclusive to the Touch Bar. There shouldn't be anything you can do on the Touch Bar that you can't do on the screen. So whether it's changing volume or controlling a scrubber or whatnot, that's all stuff that needs to be also accessible on the screen or through some other way. The secondary problem with the Touch Bar is that there's no tactile feedback like there are with traditional function keys. So there's no way to feel for which button you need. You always have to look directly at the Touch Bar. And those two things combined, I feel, make the Touch Bar far less efficient than traditional methods of interfacing with a Mac.
All right, I'm with you on the tactile feedback. And I'm with you on the guidelines. I do wish that Apple would relax this one or make a change in this one, because I think there's this incredible opportunity for genuine dedicated function keys in an app that is not being as realized as it could be or fully realized.
Right. Just as an example here, let's say you're in Microsoft Word and you want to bold some text. So the way I tend to do that sort of thing is I select the text and I press Command B and it bolds the text. Not that I use Word much, but you get the idea. So the other way you can do that is on the toolbar that's on the screen. You select some text, you click the toolbar. Now, the best way to do it is with the keyboard, because you don't have to pull your hands away from typing and you don't have to look away from the screen. You just, generally, if you're a touch typist and you've been using a Mac for a while, you know where the Command key is, you know where the B key is. You don't have to look away. You don't even have to think about it. If you're less astute with the keyboard, and a lot of people are, then if you just use the on-screen button, the advantage there is, okay, you do have to remove your hands from the keyboard. You have to, move the cursor, but your eyes stay on the screen. Problem is, so now the other way you can do that, if you have one of these fancy MacBooks like I do, you can use the Touch Bar. There's a bold button on the Touch Bar. Here's the problem. So you select your text. Now you have to look away from the screen. You have to take your hands off the keyboard, and you have to hit the button. So out of the three ways of doing that, the Touch Bar is by far the least efficient. And I've found that for most functions, it is the least efficient way of doing stuff for that very reason, because it always takes your hands off the keyboard and it always takes your eyes off the screen.
Okay, so there are a couple things that I like about the Touch Bar. If I'm in Keynote, all right, I'm able to see representations of some of my slides backwards and forwards, and I can look at now. The point you made in the article is perfect. It's a little small. Okay, but I also, at least I know if I can really tell if I've got a blue slide versus a green slide. If I'm one of those people that just puts a lot of text on slides, then it's going to be pretty much useless. But if I do that, I should be shot anyway. So
I do that.
You do that. Sorry, Josh. I think the point you made though was with Safari tabs. And I think that's a good one. Same thing. If you have a lot of similar looking tabs, it is a little small to see. But I do think there's some areas where I find it beneficial. Definitely, let's see, in Final Cut, I can scroll a lot more efficiently because I'm at least theoretically seeing a very small image, but I am seeing an image scroll under the cursor control, so I kind of know where in the file I am if it's a long file.
Mm-hmm.
So some, there's some areas here where it's probably more useful than not, but it probably could be better.
Well, yeah, and I've had some of those pointed out to me since I published the article, and I won't deny that there are a few cases where the touch bar makes a lot of sense, and of course Apple tends to highlight those. Working in Logic and Final Cut, I've heard a lot of people say they like the touch bar for those apps. One thing I actually wasn't aware of when I wrote the article that someone pointed out to me is that if you open QuickTime, it has touch bar buttons for starting recording and stopping recording. So that's cool. I don't know QuickTime well enough to tell you if there's the command, there's keyboard shortcuts for those. I'm sure there are. So it's probably kind of redundant. But, and that's one case where I think the touch bar is good. In cases where you don't necessarily know, or it's not a common keyboard shortcut, and they can present it on the touch bar. So that you don't have to what was it? Is it Command Option P? Is it what's the keyboard shortcut for that? In those cases, I do think the touch bar is useful. The problem is, at least how things are currently implemented, it's very basic for the most part. It's very basic. It's the same stuff that you already know how to do most of the time anyway. And so I think a lot of the problem with touch bar right now is the software in it, how it's implemented.
Yeah, and I have to wonder if this is another one of those cases where Apple put it out there with its current capabilities and is sort of letting it evolve and almost figuring it out themselves. It would seem like this is a pretty expensive technology to put into a machine just to see how it would evolve. But on the other hand, it's about the only way you could do it. If you had told me, I'm going to get a touch bar, well, the only thing I might have added to it is I want to be able to customize keys. I want to be able to put something custom on it. And I know Apple has really locked down a lot of things. They don't want you building games for the touch bar or having distracting animations for the touch bar. And that makes perfect sense.
Right. And when the touch bar first came out, there were a lot of really neat kind of developer tricks they did. There's like a version of Pac-Man you can play on the touch bar. There's little games. The problem with those, though, is that, and this is going to go into a broader point about Apple's developer limitations for the touch bar. So if you play Touch Bar Pac-Man, which is kind of pointless, but it's fun. It's something they just did for a goof. That app always has to be on screen. So if you switch it from the app, you lose that from the touch bar. So it's kind of like, it's not really that useful. But that's sort of the problem, though, is that Apple has it limited so that only the foremost app on the screen can really use the touch bar, can put its own stuff on the touch bar. They do have, and they add some more in High Sierra. You can go into settings and you can kind of customize the buttons and change things around, add different stuff. For instance, in High Sierra, there's an AirPlay button, which is kind of cool. You can tap that and choose an AirPlay output. So stuff like that's pretty interesting because that normally wouldn't be on the keyboard, and it's not always the easiest thing to find if you're not used to that. So that's useful. But let me tell you where I think Apple could make this a lot more useful for developers is if they made it so a developer like Keyboard Maestro is the perfect use case for this, where a developer could add their own keys to the touch bar, even for an app that's in the background. And some apps do this already, but it's sort of an ugly hack. There's an app, for instance, there's one that lets you mute or unmute the microphone, which would be really useful for a podcaster, and it adds that to the little section off to the side. I can remember what you call this. but basically the quick keys they have over on the side. So instead of four, it adds a fifth key to that. And but the problem is that since it's a hacked in unofficial Apple command strip, that's what you call it. Since it's a hacked in unofficial thing, when you go to customize which keys show up in that strip, it just disappears. Like the key just disappears. There's no way to edit it. Now, when you go back, you leave system preferences. It shows back up, but there's no way to customize where that moves to. It's just sort of there. So there are a few utilities that run in the menu bar that add stuff to the touch bar, which are useful. But I really wish Apple had a way of letting you access back capabilities from background apps from the touch bar. One of my biggest problems with Keyboard Maestro, and Keyboard Maestro is a tremendous app. It's a great app. But I have a hard time coming up with keyboard shortcuts that make sense and I can remember. It's always stuff like, and we have some of these macros we use for TidBITS all the time. I'm always trying to remember, is it Command Shift Option semicolon? Or is it just Command Shift semicolon? Is it Option Shift? And I'll kind of just fumble around with the keyboard. Some of these I have memorized, but some of them I have to fumble around a little bit, if I don't use them every day. So yeah, that would be a case where it'd be great just to look down the touch bar. There's that macro I need. Tap that. That would actually save me time.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I love keyboard shortcuts, and I know I don't memorize enough of them. I'm constantly trying to say, okay, for the next week, I'm not going to pull that menu down. I'm going to think and use the keyboard shortcuts, and eventually it becomes second nature, and that's great. But yeah, after a while, I mean, it's like there are only so many you can before you either forget them or you get hand cramps. And to have that macro button built in there so that you could do something would be absolutely great. But you also mentioned another utility that I dearly love as a way to maybe make the touch bar a little more useful, and that's Better Touch Tool.
Yeah, that's a great app. I've used it for years.
So go through a little bit about what you can do with Better Touch Tool to make of all things, the touch bar a little more useful.
So the touch bar is one of the aforementioned apps where it sort of hacks its own button into the command strip there. And it's something I haven't played around a lot on the touch bar with Better Touch Tool, but essentially you can create little macros to use in apps. It's not as elaborate as like Keyboard Meister would be, but you can trigger certain, key presses and mouse clicks and things like that. And so, Chuck, you actually might have some better uses for it, because I don't use it a whole lot, because I've played with it. I'm like, there's nothing, and I'm sort of the worst at coming up with my own automations. I can never, I don't have a ton of imagination in that area. Adam's really the whiz of the automations for the most part, but that's essentially what it lets you do. It adds an extra button, and it lets you perform some simple macros. Although in my experience, it hasn't been anything. I mean, maybe there might be some way. And I should play with this actually now that I'm thinking about it. There might be some way to trigger a Keyboard Maestro macro from Better Touch Tool. But again, you have that problem where it's really hacky and it's just kind of built into there. So let me ask you, because I'm always curious about this sort of thing. What do you use Better Touch Tool for? Do you, in terms of macros or the command strip?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I use it primarily for Final Cut. And as you might imagine, unlike some video editors, my editing is kind of routine. I've got you on screen, I've got me on screen. If I do a 4-up, then I've got 4 of us on screen. And so, you have to do the shifting back and forth. So I've set up, a couple double taps in different areas of the trackpad to cut, to select, to turn things on, turn things off. Sometimes it's cut and turn things on. Sometimes it's cut and turn things off. And I find that once again, it took a little while to learn for me, but then once I did it, I can speed through my editing a lot better. When I saw this article, it's one of those things I too have not gone and played with it, but I'm thinking, okay, there are other things I'd like to be able to do, but I'm always having to. I'm either still working on memorizing the keyboard shortcuts, and so now I'm wondering, gee, if I could, set that up as a touch bar macro that's triggered through Yeah, better touch tool. Well, that would be really useful. And you're right. Some of this stuff is just a little hacky, and that's not a bad thing because we all use our Macs in completely different ways. So you got to figure out what it is for you. I know Joe Kissel is always, I mean, he's the king of, trying to get you to think about automation because his point is, okay, it might take me an hour to set up, but then if I use it over the next year, it saves me 3 hours. So I'm 2 hours ahead. And which one of us wouldn't like to have an extra 2 hours? So
sure, absolutely. And I'm not just hating on the touch bar just to be a hater. It's one of those, when I first saw it, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I need to have that. And a lot of people like immediately start going, oh, where's my escape key? I don't have an escape key. And that's actually one problem with the touch bar. I haven't had that much because generally tapping the leftmost side of the touch bar does the same thing as hitting the escape key. Even if you don't exactly hit the button that's there already, it usually does the same thing. So it's not quite as satisfying as bam, hitting the escape key and, canceling whatever thing you're doing. But it generally, for that, it generally works okay. And as I point out in the article, the Touch ID feature is fantastic. Touch ID in general is pretty great. So, it's not so much I'm like, oh, Apple, this thing's just pointless. I just hate this thing. But here's the reality. For a MacBook Pro that with a touch bar, it's going to cost you about $300 extra, mostly for the touch bar. Now you get some extra niceties, you get some more CPU options, you get couple more USB ports that you can't really plug anything into anyway, but that's a whole other show. You get a few extra, but really when you boil it down, you're paying $300 for this cool racing stripe. That, I mean, if you got the money to spend, I mean, by all means, don't let me tell you how to blow your money. But I'm just kind of telling people who are looking at these MacBook Pros, because I hear from a lot of people every day who just are not very happy with Apple's current hardware lineup, but they got to have something new, and so they ask me, Josh, is it worth the extra money for this touch bar? And right now, I have to say, no, it's just not. And that's not to say it's a bad technology, but right now, I don't think it offers a ton of advantage for a professional user. Now if you do use something like Final Cut, or I understand Logic has a lot of the same features there. I don't use Logic. Then maybe that would be worth it for you to have that touch strip for the scrubber and for editing and all that. That might actually save you a lot of time. But that's a very niche scenario. And it seems like whenever Apple produces something they think it's for pros, it's always really focused on Final Cut. If you use professional, Apple means use Final Cut. Back when they debuted the Mac Pro, it was all about, oh, this is how they use Final Cut with this new Mac Pro to do stuff. And and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not the only kind of professional that's out there. So perhaps if you're a video editor and you use Final Cut, then Touch Bar might be worth it. And besides, you're going to want as much CPU as you can get anyway, so you probably want the higher end machine. But for most people asking me who just like to, they just want a capable Apple laptop with more than one port, and they're not necessarily a professional video editor or something, it's probably not worth it for you.
This edition of MacVoices is supported by Care.com, the easy and reliable way to find and manage care for everyone in the family. If you've ever faced the need for personal care of a loved one, you know what a daunting challenge it can be. Your loved one wants to stay at home. You want to respect those wishes, but also want to be sure that they're receiving the care they need. That can mean everything from meals, errands, housekeeping, transportation, and personal care, the whole way down to simple companionship. Who do you trust? Who should you listen to? Where do you go to get reliable information? Care.com, that's where. Care.com can help you find the kind of care you're looking for your parents or other relatives so they can stay independent. And not just care based on the medical or physical needs. Care.com recognizes that the best match, personally and emotionally, as well as a skills-based match, is essential. I can tell you from personal experience that if the personalities don't mesh, you can end up with a bigger problem than you started with. The kind of care we're talking about can be very expensive, especially if you employ agencies or opt for facility care. Care.com can help you cut those costs by as much as 50% by helping you select home-based options. That's a win in the financial column as well as for your loved one. and that means it's a win for you too. Find out about what all Care.com offers and how they can help you take on one of the toughest responsibilities of your life by visiting Care.com/MacVoices. When you use that link, you can save 30% off a Care.com premium membership. So right off the bat, you're saving money and getting the answers you need. That's Care.com/MacVoices. Even if you don't have need of their services right now, odds are that at some time you will. Get the information you need right now and be ready. Thanks to Care.com for their support of MacVoices. One thing I've been surprised that we've had this much time. I think this was this November, December that this was introduced?
Yeah,
in that general time frame. I am surprised, and I think it would make a difference for everyone if they had brought a keyboard out for the iMac or the Mac Pro or whatever, but if they'd have brought a keyboard out with a touch bar. Because right now the touch bar is strictly limited to the MacBook Pro. And
right.
Yeah, there's some logic to why you would want, and certainly some very good logic as to why it makes more sense to be integrated in there. But I think it would have made a much bigger difference in adoption and maybe innovation if it had been available to a wider audience. But that's just me.
Yeah, and one of the things I've heard is apparently Touch ID over Bluetooth would be a no-go. I don't really understand why not, but that's one of the things I've heard. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I mean that to me says something with the touch bar. It tells me that Apple isn't terribly invested in it. It's more like here's a gimmick to sell MacBooks Pro. It's not something they're really set on for the future, because it seems to me if they consider, the touch bar, you got to have it. If you're a professional doing professional things on a professional computer, you need a touch bar, or you're not going to get stuff done. And they've already shown the keyboard for this new iMac Pro they're coming out with, right? And it doesn't have a touch bar, and these new iMacs, which they said were for professional production. I mean, they're talking about video editing, they're talking about creating VR experiences and so forth. No touch bar on those. So, you can't help but wonder, it's like, well, how invested are they in this concept? Or, and this is me being super cynical, did they have all this leftover Apple Watch R&D and they had to figure out some way to sell people MacBooks? So they're like, well, hey, let's put an Apple Watch in the MacBook Pro. There we go. It's a professional feature now.
Oh wow, that is cynical. Apple doesn't, there are companies out there that shall remain nameless that I could see doing that. Apple isn't one of them. I don't know if this is just a vision not fully realized, or a vision that they started down the path and can't, or at this point don't want to do. And I have to be fair about it, Josh. If I might buy it again, because now I've become very, very used to the very precise controls I can have over audio or brightness. I mean, some of those are better than the function key shifts. They're along the lines of being able to pull down in the menu and adjust exactly the volume where I want it or the brightness where I want it. Mm-hmm. And okay, so I recognize that's just an alternative, but it definitely is more convenient to have the touch bar right there to be able to do it, as opposed to going and trying to hunt for something in the menu bar or somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think there are definitely use cases. Now, for me, the brightness and volume controls I find less efficient on the touch bar for the same reasons I outlined in the beginning. Because right now I can control my volume, just my brightness. I'm doing it right now. I'm not even looking away from you. My hand's on the keyboard, and this is on an iMac, so there's no touch bar here. And then if I want to control volume with the touch bar, I have to look down at least for a second and, put my finger in the right place. Now, one nice thing they're doing in High Sierra is once you tap the volume control to bring up the slider, you don't have to actually put your finger over the slider. You can just tap it and then move your finger. So it's a little less distracting, but you still have the basic problem. I guess some people might have the exact location memorized. I don't know. I'd be curious to meet these people, but they might be superhuman. But they can just But you still have the problem. You have to at least look down for a split second to adjust it, and and maybe I'm just being an old fuddy-duddy. I don't know, but for me, it's just for most things, it's less efficient. There are ways I think Apple could turbocharge the touch bar to make it more like here's the thought. What if you had the function keys like you've always had, and then you had a touch bar? Like let's say they came out with a Magic Keyboard that had both, or they came out with like probably won't work on a 13-inch, but like a 15-inch MacBook Pro. You could probably do both. You could have the touch bar and the function keys. Now that would be something. Then you could have your volume keys right there and always accessible, and then have something different and unique in the touch bar, and then have additional stuff in there. And one of the things I mentioned in the article, if they used some of this Force Touch, 3D Touch stuff that they have in the iPhone and in their trackpads now, and they can do a very convincing job of making you feel like you're touching a real button. For instance, the home button in my iPhone 7 Plus doesn't move. But it's all Force Touch, and I can't really feel a difference between it and a physical button, except I don't get crud stuck in the button like I used to on my old iPhones. It's more reliable. So, and that's something I suggested in the article. If you can make some way to give that tactile feedback in the touch bar, then that would instantly make it a lot more useful.
And maybe that'll happen. Maybe not with this iteration. Again, maybe this was a bit of a trial balloon to see just how well it worked or how well it was adapted to. And I guess I'm not one of those that is militant about having to keep my eyes right on the screen. I mean, I don't think I wonder a lot, but at the same time, some people are just like, I never want to have to touch the mouse. I never want to have to take my eyes off what I'm doing. And that's fine. I'm not one of those, so maybe that part of the argument doesn't apply to me. But it's an interesting technology. I'm with you. It feels like it's been just a little hobbled by the interface guidelines that Apple has, and I'd like to see them loosen up. So,
yeah, I think there's definite room. I mean, without even a hardware revision, I think Apple could do, and just give the developers some more capabilities. They've done this whole thing, and they've done this a lot of things that I won't name, Apple Watch and Apple TV, but where they throw stuff out there and they're like, you figure it out, and then people try to figure it out, and either people aren't buying the thing, or it's a pain to work with, or Apple has really limited what exactly you can do with it. So you end up, and I think that's kind of what's happened with the touch bar. It's limited, so people are like, okay, I don't know, just put a bold button there. Okay, sure, why not? There we go, touch bar support. That's easy to do. And and realistically, I mean, if you're a developer, you'd have to be sort of insane, if you're a commercial developer, to focus on touch bar users, because that's got to be at most 1% of the whole market. There's not that many people out there with a touch bar on their Mac, because it's a subset, it's a small subset of MacBook Pro users, the iPad, the iMac, the Mac Mini. So you don't really have much incentive to invest heavily in it. And this is why another thing I say in the article, it's really on Apple. And this goes for a lot of things they're trying to push, whether it's tvOS apps, whether it's professional apps for the iPad, whether it's touch bar apps. Apple really has to set a standard here. Like you were talking about being able to view the slides in Keynote. I think that's great. They should do more stuff like that. They need to show people what you can really do with this stuff, because no one is as invested in making these technologies work as Apple. Because ultimately, when at the end of the day, Apple's main business is selling hardware. So if they want to do that, they have to show how that hardware can be used creatively and help build an ecosystem around that.
Yeah. We would both be great as CEOs of Apple, because we know exactly what needs to be done.
I'd be terrible.
Yeah, so would I. And that's, I sometimes I resist doing this kind of show or having this kind of discussion, because we are second guessing the guys, and I have no idea what it took to put the touch bar in, and I have even less of an idea about what it takes to support it in software. But at the end of the day, I do feel qualified as a user to say, okay, it's good. It's not great. I'm kind of on the bubble. I think I would buy it again just because of the promise I think I see, and I don't think I'm deluding myself. And your point about Apple Watch technology, that's interesting. Could there be some other apps or Macified apps that would normally be a watch app or an iOS app running there, and I'm not starting the whole the operating systems are converging thing, but it just there are some things that touch, It felt like at the time I remember discussing it, it felt like an interesting compromise for all those people who kept screaming, we want to be able to touch our screen. That, okay, this is a way to do it. And it just hasn't been followed through on, at least as far as we know yet. And I don't know about you, Josh. I don't want to touch my screen. I mean, my screen gets dirty enough as it is. I don't want my grimy fingers all over my screen. So
I'm sort of neutral on the touchscreen Mac front. There's a lot of potential and possibility there. On the other hand, I don't really care. That's sort of my thing. If it were there and available, I don't. Some people say they feel a compulsion to touch their screen because they're so used to touching their iPads and iPhones. I just don't, because it's a different kind of screen. It's oriented differently. And also, I do think Apple has a good argument in saying that macOS is not tailored to touchscreen. I'm just looking at my Mac right now. I'm looking at the little tiny buttons at the corner of the window to expand and close a window. I'm like, boy, that would be hard to hit with a finger and do so accurately. Microsoft's had some success in this front, but it's been very hard-won success. It kind of involved trashing Windows is bad enough as is, but it kind of involved trashing Windows for a few years while they worked out the kinks, and they're still working out a lot of kinks. I do think eventually, 10, 20 years from now, I do think iOS and macOS will converge. And a lot of people get upset when I mention that. I just see the macOS is heading towards iOS and iOS is heading toward macOS. And sooner or later, they probably will cross paths. I do think that is inevitable because it's hard to support multiple operating systems. It's hard to support, there's a lot of advantages for everyone in terms of convergence. And Microsoft's shown that. The Surface is a really interesting device. It's not a very good device. Consumer Reports just trashed them for being unreliable, but it's an interesting idea. And Microsoft's taken a different path to get there. They've sort of just plowed through the woods, Jim Carrey style, just charging right through the trees and through the jungle and everything else. And, if we wreck, we wreck. I commend them for their boldness. Apple's taking a much more conservative approach where, we have two totally separate things, and we're going to make this one a little more like this one, and this one a little more like this one. And John Siracusa had a great point about the Touch Bar when Apple first announced it, how, over time the keys get flatter, the more of the keyboard becomes a touch screen, and, just over time, the MacBook slowly becomes an iPad, and sort of vice versa. I do think there's a glacial path there to convergence, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
And I hope it doesn't, because if it does, it's going to be met with a lot of resistance and a lot of upset people. But if you do the migration slowly, if that really is the ultimate objective, then okay. Because one of my favorite things, Josh, is, and I don't know about you, but if I look back 5 years ago, I'm not using a lot of the same stuff that I am now. If I go back 10 years, it's even more. And these people that think that, okay, I've got my setup and I'm never going to have to change it, are just deluding themselves. It's time and tech march on. And yeah, if you want to keep running, an accounting program from 2001, good for you. If it does what you need, that's fine. But, the newsflash, the tax code has changed.
Yeah. Well, people like to bring up how George R. R. Martin still, writes in WordStar from the 80s. The only problem is he hasn't produced an actual book in years, so you have to question how well that's working for him.
Yeah, and I've said this too on the show plenty of times. Look, these are all tools, and find the tool that works for you. And if it's a 10-year-old computer and a 10-year-old software program, and it does what you need it to do, more power to you. That's fine, but don't expect the rest of us to stay there with you in a 10-year-old program when we have other things that we need to do or want to do.
In terms of that, I just have one piece of advice. By all means, use what you like. If you still like to use an Apple II for something, I can't say to blame you, but have an eye for, when this thing dies or something goes wrong. Have an eye for how you're going to move to something that's better maintained, because there's nothing worse. I get emails about this all the time. I'm using this accounting software from 1985. I'll seriously have emails like this. And how would I get this running on a 2017 Mac Pro? And it's like, well, I mean, and usually virtualization is the answer there. But we really do have this problem because especially at TidBITS, because we have a lot of people who've been using Mac literally from day one, and they have stuff, I mean, data literally from the 80s that they're trying to figure out, okay, well, I moved it to a different shell in 2002, and how do you keep maintaining that? And it's not always necessarily just stubbornness, but it's just one of those things. If you've been keeping the same kind of data in weird proprietary formats for a long time, that's really the key there. I mean, if you have a text file from 20 years ago, you don't really have a problem. Or if you have a JPEG from 20 years ago, it's not a problem. But when you have stuff in weird database formats, and that's where you really come into the problems. So I'll just say use what you like, but have an eye toward the future. Have an eye toward how you're going to keep this thing going another 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even the less than mainstream formats. I mean, I have people constantly ask me, how do I open my AppleWorks documents? That I had. I did my college papers in AppleWorks, and it's like, you have a problem. I mean, you're almost going to have to go find somebody in an Apple museum that is running AppleWorks and let them open it. Hopefully, you can export it to something a little more current. But
I think I have some papers from high school, maybe college, that were written in Corel or something. So I have no idea how I'd extract those. I'm sure there's something out there, but it's not an easy problem. Yeah,
and those were pretty mainstream formats at the time. So
right.
Just because you're using what's popular doesn't mean it's always going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, on this one, I'm not sure we solved anything. I don't know that there was an argument to be won. It was just an interesting examination. And I'm not sure. I think I would buy mine again. Sounds like you wouldn't.
Probably not, for a few different reasons. But I think this sort of thing is helpful because people from Apple do listen to this sort of thing. They do read articles on TidBITS and so forth. And I think, they appreciate when you put stuff out there that's a constructive criticism that offers some suggestions. I've seen things I've written articles about. I'm not trying to boast here, but I've just seen stuff where I'm like, hey, you could fix it by doing this, and they end up doing something like that or similar to it. So I think this is helpful, and I think when you work at Cupertino, when you work at Apple, you're probably in something of a bubble, and that's definitely seems to be the case because Apple always has a certain thought process. Oh, this is how people actually use things, and it's not necessarily the case. So I think it's always good to try to point out publicly, and not in a rude or malicious way, but just to point out that no, actually, this is more how we use it, and this is something else you may not have considered. And I think that can be helpful for the folks back at Cupertino.
100% agree with you, and I applaud the way that you did it in the article, and you do it here. You're right. It's not screaming crazy. It's not condemning. It's just a serious examination of what it is and what we think it could be. So hopefully we've done the same thing here, that I've held up my end of the bargain.
Yeah.
Josh, it's always great to see you. I really appreciate it. We will do it again with who knows what. I don't know. What are you going to condemn next?
I have a long list. I mean, we can just review it.
Sounds good. I'll look forward to it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Chuck.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. I hope you got something out of this. It's a fun debate to have. And if you have these burningly fantastic uses for the touch bar, please let Josh and I know, because we'd like to get in on the action. Until the next time, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes, links to subscribe, and to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, SoundCloud, the MacVoices blog, the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter, and on MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard that helps you do more with your Apple tech. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.